you state your name, your title, and how long you've been in your position?
Okay, I'm Deborah Maxwell. I am a high school mathematics teacher, and I have been teaching high school mathematics for about, I started in around 1990. Before that, I taught middle school, and before that, I taught elementary school. So I've been teaching, I think, about 36 years, give or take, altogether.
So, what other leadership roles that you have you taken also for being a math teacher? I know you're part of you're vice president of the.
I am part of my teachers union. We're all members, but I became a building director a number of years ago, and then I became the high school vice president for the union. And I've been on the negotiating team, and we are in the process of negotiating. And yesterday was a good day because we may have an agreement. So that's always good news. This late. We're right now working without a contract, and so it raises a lot of tensions in the school when you go most of the year without a contract. People get a little frustrated and makes it tough.
Okay, so can you tell us what your school is? Like, what type of school is it? A public school?
I'm in a public school. It is. I'm in a high school that has, I think I heard today, 2,500 or maybe 2,700 students. It fluctuates. And so the high school is divided into 5 houses, and I'm in one of the 5 houses. Our house happens to be not in the main campus, but at a separate location. And we have approximately 400 students in our house. It's been growing.
Can you describe like the other houses, like what type of?
There are several programs. One is called the School of Fine Arts, and that has drama, dance, art, several things. They're actually quite proud of themselves. They just won a nationwide school board award for supporting the arts and creating this program, and that has been in existence the longest. There is one called Global Commerce, which is geared more toward business and global issues. There's a math, science, and technology house that obviously is geared more into that direction. And then the other house is, I'm trying to remember, it was called the GE Scholars. And now I think it's, I'm not sure the new name for that, but it's more of a general education track and college preparatory. But then they all are geared to get kids to either further education in a specific program or to college. And then the house I'm in is called the Career Center.
So, would you consider your school a large school even though everything's divided?
Yes, it's very large. The school initially, was built to house about 1,000, and now it's up to 2,000 plus our separate building. So it's very crowded. And there's been some expansion, and they plan more. So yeah, it's very large. And that was one of the reasons they broke it into houses, to try and give some sense of belonging within that large number of students.
So do you consider? Yeah. So would you consider the same model that your school? It's called the Steinmetz, the career.
The Career Center it's in a building called Steinmetz, so they call it the Career Center at Steinmetz. It houses some other programs in addition to ours.
So what is the whole school called collectively?
That with the other houses, the whole thing is called Schenectady High School. And there's the main campus, and then there's our campus.
So when did Schenectady High School develop the plan to start dividing into smaller learning communities, and what pushed for it?
I think the biggest push for it, there was the fine arts program got developed, and then as the student population grew, there was a push to somehow subdivide students so that they would have more of a belonging within this big entity. And so the other houses were formed. The GE Scholars had been a separate program that General Electric funded initially, and that was why it was called GE Scholars. And so those 2 programs, the other houses were added to give other students in the building also some kind of program.
So students from different houses, can they use each other's resources, or is it just
Absolutely. And they can take courses cross houses. That basically gives them a base. But yeah, students that want to can take courses in the fine arts or any of the other schools, any of the other houses.
Do you feel that the change in with the push of the fine arts program, did any of the change was it pushed by the Nation at Risk document too, or was it just?
No, I think it was just more local. The size of the school really encouraged that. And the fine arts program was just, there was an interest on the school board to do more with the arts. And that program emerged out of that interest on the school board.
Like, I'm not what isn't, but what falls under fine art? Is that like home economics and technology and music?
It includes music, drama, music of all sorts, drama, and then the different arts, painting, sculpture, anything within the arts.
Okay, and that was a program that was expanded, not as in, because in like in the 1960s, 1970s, and then A Nation at Risk, there was the idea of that allowing schools to create curriculums that allowed for like home economics and technology, took away from the fundamentals of education. So in 1983, the Nation at Risk was the point that they addressed was get back to the basics, like focus on math, focus on science, focus on the advanced sciences that are coming to dominate our culture. So how by there was a push to eliminate those programs and focus more on that. Would fine arts be, do you feel like it benefits education, or do you feel that it takes away from it?
Oh, I think all of the programs benefit. There's certain what we call core curriculum, which would be English, social studies, science, and math. There are a number of courses that every high school student from special ed up through has to take and pass in order to graduate in New York State. And then in addition to that, students have electives. And so the fine arts courses would probably be considered electives, although in some cases they do interdisciplinary, so there might be an English course where they're reading a play, and then the students might be taking a drama class where they're actually, preparing to put on the play, and there would be an art class that was preparing the set. So there's a number of things within that. They also have done an excellent, every summer they do video productions, which are pretty amazing. The quality and what they've put out are really pretty amazing. They've done everything from more drama type ones to documentaries, the whole spectrum. And the students pretty much do that on their own. So it affords them opportunities beyond the core courses, but New York has a pretty high standard for what is required of every high school student to graduate. So those things are there
Okay.
in addition.
Greg, just move a little bit to your right.
Am I right? And can you talk a little bit about Nation at Risk? Are you familiar with that report?
Yes. I think that's something that gets a lot of play probably in the public more than within the school, because we're aware of the concerns and the issues pretty much day to day. And so it doesn't come as news to us that there needs to be more done. With many urban districts, a lot of the issues you face are monetary. Districts didn't have enough money. Probably the most relevant thing to our school district was that campaign for fiscal equity that took place in New York. Was a case out of New York City, but when it was settled also included the larger cities and even the medium-sized cities, and have brought in the last 2 years more money into urban schools. Prior to that, we didn't have money. We would have, this would be a great program, this is a great idea, and then the next question would be, does it cost anything? And if the answer was yes, then the next answer was, well, we probably can't do it, not because people didn't want to. And a lot of the needs within the public schools have been the differential that plays out differently in each state, but between suburban and urban districts, both the needs of the students and the financial money coming in. And in New York State, it's pretty clearly has been not equitable. And so that has been the biggest help to us.
To continue on with the Nation at Risk, it spoke about, I mean, you talk about economics and affecting different areas and how, but as a whole, there was a lot of reports that were written about the state of education in the 1980s, and why would the Nation at Risk get more focused than other reports?
You know, I couldn't answer. It's that's an interesting question, actually. Maybe just the title, Nation at Risk, it spoke to real needs that are out there. A lot of times you will hear things that speak about the problems. As an educator, what is usually missing is the solutions, or more importantly, the money to carry them through. And it goes to, more recently in campaigns, I've heard some of the candidates speak to walking through public schools and just seeing this physical plant that kids are in school in, with roofs leaking. And so you're sitting in a classroom and there's water dripping. And these are issues that take money to fix. In aging districts, the tax base, and again, I come back to money, but a city like Schenectady, they lost major industrial base. So their taxes are very high. And as a person who lives in the city, if they tell me they're going to raise taxes, I'm thinking it's absurd. But as an educator, we need the money. And so the economic piece of it is how to better and more fairly fund public schools so that they're on a fair playing field. Because other districts have a huge tax base and the actual property assessment is such that no one person is paying so much. And that's, those are the issues that the Campaign for Fiscal Equity looked at and really began to address.
So with funding, it would be in a poor urban community or a poor community or rural community?
Rural too, very much so.
In a way, they equal. I mean, urban and rural will be just as poor in different ways, but that is where the federal government would step in and supplement the differences. Correct? Is that the way it should be? And
Certainly, that would help. Both the state and the federal government can do things to help. The federal government right now gives money to districts, but it's a very small part of the budget. I looked up the percent, and I think in 2006, 7% of the money came from the federal government. So when they talk about increasing it or decreasing it, it doesn't have much of an impact on the local level by the time it gets to us. So there might be a program, you apply for a grant, and that's become more and more the way districts try to do things. They apply for grants, they get money maybe to reduce class size. They get that money for 3 years, then at the end of that time they've either got to find another way to fund it or the program goes away. And then you're looking for another program or another source. So more continuity in funding and a higher share from the federal government maybe to education than say to war would be. When I was first teaching, there was a saying about, wouldn't it be nice if we had to do fundraisers for B-52 bombers, not PTA sales for schools, and that's not changed. There's an excellent book that looks at a lot of the education inequalities, Jonathan Kozol's Savage Inequalities, and he not only speaks to that, but even speaks to the ways that attempts to fix it are sabotaged by then lowering what you pay every district, and districts then raise money. So that's a tricky issue, very tricky.
I was going to bring John Kozol up in a little bit, but he saw a speech.
I think I'm talking 2 or 3 books ago, because he has been, since I started teaching, he has been a voice within education and advocating. And the issues that he brought up are unfortunately much the same in many ways.
And so, we can go back, but on funding, do you think a lot of solutions or a lot of problems in public schools could be solved by more direct funding from the federal government?
I think it could be solved more obviously, if the federal government were to give more to education, that would be a nice thing. And also, I think states have to seriously look at moving away from property tax as the major funding source for school districts, because different communities have different tax bases. They don't all have the same resources. So there has to be a fairer way to fund public schools.
The way charter schools are funded, they're allocated a certain amount of federal money or state money per pupil based on accountability. Would accountability be something that affects public schools? Are public schools is their performance, if a higher performing high school, would they get more money than a low performing? Or is it really based on the local legislator and the amount of money?
Well, no, New York State has a pretty confusing formula for how it disperses monies. And so what districts get is based on that formula. And then there are also caps. For example, no matter how much your district's population increases, there's a cap on how much your funding from one year to the next can increase. And that would affect any school district whose population is increasing. And at the same token, the legislature has caps so that it can't decrease. So some of the suburban districts have benefited pretty much from that, where they are guaranteed at least a certain amount. It can't drop too much from the year before. I would disagree with you that charter schools are funded from the state. In New York, they have some states, it has gone from the state to the charter schools. In New York, it's paid from the local district to the charter school. It's paid up front. They say we have 700 students, we pay them for 700. And then if that drops, we get the money back at the end of the year, so we don't have it to use during the year. And of course, one of the arguments is what students are really there, because there may not be clear communication. And if you're looking specifically at Schenectady, that has been an issue. They were arguing about how many students and should we pay you before we know, and the state took the funding and gave it to the charter school, and the district is concerned because now the charter school is closing and there will be many creditors coming after them. They're worried that they won't get monies back that might indeed, they might have overpaid. And again, within New York State, the schools are held pretty accountable at this point, not necessarily by the No Child Left Behind, which is one set of rules, but also within New York State, there are several different guidelines, and a school gets labeled, and I'm not going to be able to rattle off all the different names, but you have 1 year, you're in danger of going on their list, and then you go on and you have to have a remedial plan. And if you don't show progress, then the state ultimately can come in, and they actually did go in and take over one school district. I think it got worse after they did that. But
So you're saying for public schools, the state would...
The state does this,
and
yes.
that's part of the No Child Left Behind.
It could be part of the No Child, but in New York State, there were separate regulations that have been doing that before No Child Left Behind. And some schools, for example, our high school is not considered a Title I school, and therefore they don't get federal Title I monies. So we aren't subject to No Child Left Behind, but we are subject to state rules, graduation rates, passing rates on the different Regents tests, and so on. So there's probably more regulation from New York State than No Child Left Behind would have brought. No Child Left Behind brought in a ton of testing especially for the elementary teachers. I'm not in elementary school, but it's they spend so much time testing. It's actually taking time out of teaching to take the tests, and of course time out to prepare for the tests. And while testing is good, you can overdo a good thing. And at this point, I think most educators would feel both the federal government isn't paying to do the testing, teachers are taken out of the class to go correct them. There's so many issues where that's not really helping education. And it is really taking a lot of time out. And youngsters, 7-year-olds are sometimes in tears about these tests. It's just becoming not a pleasurable place to be, but high stakes testing. And everything gets geared toward that because districts get identified. They will have their name all over the page if they don't pass them. So whether you feel the tests are the most important or not, that's obviously what you have to do.
But as we're doing this study of or education, the testing is what is the problem. It seems like not only for what charter schools are focused on, but what public education is focused on is the testing. Like
It's horrible.
what the problem is. Not so much that there's a problem in charter schools or there's a problem in the public education. It's the curriculum. So, I mean, if you're limiting the curriculum to pass this test so that the school doesn't look bad or the charter school gets their charter resigned, how is that effective to education? Which is the ultimate goal, I would assume.
Well, I certainly think that standards are important. And you want, we argue over what should be those standards. You certainly want students leaving able to read, able to write, which probably they're not, and able to do mathematics. A lot of the mathematics, I can speak to that most directly, I would consider more theoretical math that is most appropriate for a subset of kids that are going to go on. And we're no longer teaching any of the mortgage, financial stuff that everybody ought to know because you use it everywhere. The test that we're getting rid of, which is a good thing, and there's yet another new math test coming in. We have been probably the single test standard that has changed the most in the last 10 years. There's not been a time we weren't in transition. The one that we're getting rid of, the curve is so low on the test, it's embarrassing. And yet what it does is it asks students to sit for a test where, as a teacher, I have to tell them, well, much of it you're not going to be able to do because, you haven't learned it yet or this or that, and you'll still be able to pass, which is probably the most awful thing I've ever had to do. The old Regents test, the 65 was the 65. And so at least that meant something. We have a new test coming out in June, and we don't even know. When we correct it, we're not going to know what that curve will be. So that'll be an interesting prospect. They're going to take it away and figure it out. The math test was so bad that one year they actually threw it out because not only were urban districts having trouble, but suburban districts, students failed at huge rates, so they threw it out that year.
I know when I was leaving high school, the movement was towards this standardized. This is the test that everybody will take, and there will be a curve to allow people to pass it. And like it was a Regents test, and you could pass it with a 50. You could pass it
With 55, probably.
Yeah, 55, and get a high school diploma.
A local
But
one.
a local diploma to get the Regents diploma. So the shift that you're seeing is away from standardized testing, or it's?
Well, no, there's no shift away from it, and we're stuck with it for now. When you left, you could get 55s. The standard is raising, and now it will be, each year it increases. And I think the students that start this year must get 65s on all of the Regents that they're required to take to get out of school. New York has always had Regents tests, but there was a system that was in place for years. And there was not a curve. There was a test. And you passed it or you didn't. The curve came in with these more higher standards So one has to wonder if we've set the standards correctly, if what we're doing is setting them at a certain point and then curving. And for certain special ed students, the requirement is, and some in No Child Left Behind deals with that, the move is to inclusion, which is a wonderful thing, to have more students as much as possible in the same classrooms. But these students, some students that have no chance, that, we don't have any kind of individual flexibility. All special ed students have to sit for these tests before they can take a test that would be considered more appropriate for their ability level. And so why are we, what are we accomplishing when we say that as a state? Because the kids are not even expected. Nobody's expecting them to pass, but they have to sit. So what is that about? And they try to prepare them, but, basically it just makes them feel bad. I've had students crying during tests, sobbing, because they want to graduate and they're afraid they're not passing this test. So the pressures on students nowadays is just huge. And that, of course, lowers how they do if they're that stressed.
You talk about standards, and what are standards based on? Are they based on like the highest performance, or are they based on international standards? Are they based on?
Well, they're certainly not based on international standards. Within New York, these Regents tests, there's a committee that gets together and comes up with what the standard's going to be. A number of years ago, before you were in school, evidently, the standard, it was almost a 7th grade standard that kids had to pass to get a high school diploma. And they said, we're going to raise that standard. That was not, in my opinion, a bad thing. But when they raised it, they went to tests that covered not a year of material, but a year and a half. It covered, a lot of it was theoretical, and not all kids, I could give my students a question and they could answer it, but the form of the test they can't answer. The mathematics test, since that's my field, is very dependent on reading. So students that might be good at mathematics, and if I verbally say a question they can handle, can't do it because they can't read the question. Sometimes we read as math teachers and we debate, what is it really asking? If that's happening, what are students who are feeling pressured and nervous and reading a question? And again, it's for the whole spectrum. So it seems that we haven't really gotten to the point where we have standards that I think are the appropriate ones for mathematics.
Each state has different standards.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the most recent example of that is they're now talking about, they look at dropout rates amongst other things, and the federal government is finally saying, well, we're going to have to make one definition of what it means for a student to drop out, because every state has been coming up with their own version. And so they might say if a student leaves the high school and goes to GED program, they're not a dropout. In other states, they might actually follow them. Do they get a GED? So there's a whole spectrum on that. And basically, people are playing with the numbers to make their state look better and other states look worse. And the same with standards. And New York has always had those standardized high school tests. When I graduated in Connecticut, we didn't have those. New York had them even back then and had them for a number of years. At that time, they were partially used to help get scholarships. If you did well in your regents, you were also, eligible for regent scholarships. So that may have been an initial reason they put them in. But they have had those standards for an awfully long time, and in all the core areas.
Going back to A Nation at Risk, I asked you why it's considered like the pinnacle report of a failing public education system. And what I've studied is that not only like its language, it was more militant language. Like it stated that we are committing like an act of treason by not educating our population.
Mm-hmm.
So if the ultimate goal is to create a sense of like nationality or a sense of community and be able to communicate and work as a nation and function as a nation, if that's the idea of education, then how, in your opinion, I guess, how can there be differences in standards between state to state, or how can there be a difference between standards in a public education system and a charter school or a private school?
Well, I think in New York, the charter schools actually do take those same standardized tests, and I can't speak to other states. How they don't necessarily get closed or criticized as quickly, at least from a public school perspective. Although, obviously, in Schenectady, it's being closed, so they're not going to say that to you. But they did have a number of years and a number of turnovers and a number of problems. I think that, to me, education has two major roles. One is that forming a common base of knowledge, sort of a community. And I think compared to when I was in school, there's a lot more of that, just because the schools are integrated. You know, topics that I have sat and had discussions with students about race, ethnicity, sex, any of those topics when I was in school, you know, none of that happened. I think that we have made tremendous strides in a lot of the things that go on that way. And that is one purpose of education. Another purpose is to go out and be able to be useful in society, either to be prepared to go on or to be prepared to get a job. It used to be kids would come out in Schenectady, the perfect example, they could come out and get a job at GE. They didn't have to have a high school diploma. Nowadays, a high school diploma is almost worthless. You're going to get minimum wage jobs and that's it. So it's much more important that students get a high school diploma, but that is only the beginning. Where is it going from there? What program are they going into? And so I think we're doing both things. And it varies. Sometimes we talk about the broad-based knowledge that everybody should have, and other times it becomes we're just preparing them for a job, and I think both are wrong. There has to be a mix. But I think it's tremendously important. There's a group of students that go on to college and are going to find some pathway. There are a whole group of students that graduate and are kind of floating, and that's a huge, huge problem. And community colleges have grown a lot over the last 10, 20 years, and that's one reason, because students need to go on and get some more specific training for something, or they're not going to get a job. So I think the pressure to get kids through high school has increased, and it wasn't there before. Kids dropped out, they were okay, and they knew they'd be okay. That's been, even just in the years I've been teaching, that change really has taken place.
Right. The demands put on students has definitely increased and is at times overwhelming for a lot. You know, times change at a rapid pace and at a more rapid pace than they had previously, just 30 years ago. You know? So
even 20.
so the most schools are constantly in need of improvement, and not
And
necessarily
change.
improvement, but just change and adaptation. And to label a school ineffective because it can't adapt, because it still deals with a community that is. So how would you deal with individual communities and make it? I just think of like a standardized test as being what everybody in the nation should. That's the standard. But every community, I mean, I just think of like South Colony and North Colony, and they're two schools that are 10 miles apart that are completely different. You know? One's a high-performing high school and one's a low-performing high school. So what makes that difference? Why? Is it demographics in that we're not focusing enough on each community?
I think that
I'd like to add something too to when you compare North and South Colony. Like in New York City, there's these two schools, like Jamaica High School and Thomas Edison Vocational High School, and they're separated by one street. And Thomas Edison School their success rates are above average, where you have Jamaica High School, which is just failing and it's a dangerous school. So it couldn't be like it's like just a street apart. So it's in the same community, you're getting the same funding, headed by the New York Department of Education. So like I feel like North Colony and South Colony, yeah, is 10 miles apart, but I feel like you have schools that are across the street from each other, funded by the same department, but ran by different administration. Like
Mhm.
I just wanted to add that example in. Like it's
Mhm.
just 0.2 miles. You just walk
Mhm.
and you're there.
You know, I think ultimately you have to look that all students can achieve to the same level if we do our job and we're creative enough. I think it can be very hard if you have, as she mentioned, administration. That's very important. Right now, the building I'm in, my administrator, we are almost daily talking about, all right, we've got this group of kids that aren't succeeding, so what are we going to do with them? And we've got this group, what are we going to do for them? Or this individual student, what are we going to do for them? And in many cases, that's the level that it ultimately has to come down to. Each student needs their own plan within this broader thing that we have for all students. And no two students are alike. You know, if a student has a year where a parent dies, you have to deal with that. And there are consequences of that, and we need ways to keep them, help get them through it, and keep them on board. And, you know, the problems out there are tremendous that the students are coming into school with. But if the school is always reaching for, now we need to figure out what to do with this group of kids, with this group. The other piece is to help early, because I work high school. If you have a student that has failed for the last 8 years, they come with a whole set of beliefs about themselves that are very hard to change. And, you know, I really have never met a student that didn't want to learn if you could catch them at the right moment and give them the right activity. But they come with so much baggage that then you have to figure out, how do we get them to believe they too can start to function and to succeed. If I get a student in high school who has been in trouble, who has missed a whole ton of school, and now they're in a high school math class, but their skills are really, you know, 6th grade, what programs can we develop to help them? And they're not going to just go to anything. You can't teach them like you might have in 6th grade. But how do we support them and yet let them function and not make them feel embarrassed in front of their peers? So there's all of those questions come together into a school, and how you come up with those solutions are what are going to make you successful or not. And then whether you get the support to try plans, you know.
I just want to talk about accountability. Whenever we hear a discussion about charter schools,
Oh, sorry, did I mess up your camera?
do you need to take a break for?
No, I just moved, and I hope I didn't mess the camera up.
When we have any discussion about charter schools, it's always accountability, and the accountability falls on the school, but in my opinion, it falls on the student. You're holding the student accountable to pass this test, to improve, to make sure that your charter can get re-signed. So accountability in a public school system, who is ultimately accountable for a child to learn? Is it the child? Is it the teacher? Is it administration? Is it the parents? Where is there?
I guess that's a bad question, because the answer is the obvious, all of them.
Right.
And the more, you're going to be more successful when everybody's working together. That ultimately, it's not.
Where do you feel it lacks most then?
It lacks?
Yeah.
You know, again, that's situation to situation. In one case, it might be the teacher. In one, it might be the parents are keeping the child home, and, you know, so then I might say it's social service that's not doing their job to get that student to school for me. In another case, they might be on probation, but they're making excuses for them. You know, it could be anything. It could be an administrator that is so tough to work with that teachers are leaving in droves. It could be any of those things, and usually is a mix.
I know you mentioned before how at your school the teachers don't have a contract.
Well, in New York State, we have a contract, but we didn't get a new contract, so.
So, you were explaining on how having the teachers be part of helping them develop a plan and things like that. How would the fact that the teacher doesn't have like a new contract, what would motivate them to continue to, be devoted to the student if this same system is not helping them and watching their back? So,
I think for the most part, teachers do what they do because they care about the kids. I think if you were to, I can't imagine more than 10% of the teachers would say the kids are the problem. It's really, they get frustrated by administration, they get frustrated by all the outside factors that influence things. But the teachers are there because they like kids. If you don't, I can't imagine you would last longer, you would want to stay. You run into a few, but we're there because we care about the kids. And so teachers usually step up and do extra, do what they need to do, regardless of those other issues.
Okay, so in regards to charter schools, there's been a so-called charter school movement, a growth in charter schools as being an alternative to public schools. And why do you feel that has been? Why has there been a growth in public or charter schools over the last decade?
Well, I think, public schools aren't perfect, and there always is room for improvement. And, that will be the case forever. We could always do better. There's always something more we could do. If you take that and set it against a backdrop of wanting things like vouchers, which politically was not succeeding, charter schools are an avenue to work toward vouchers. So they got some support from that. Companies that run management companies or textbook companies could view them as a way to make a lot of money, because if you run some of the bigger companies like Edison, they supply all those products, so they can make big money on having charter schools all over, and then economies of scale. So there's money to be made, and that's another reason. So in a way, trying to privatize education, in a way like trying to privatize medicine, some of the issues are similar. And what ends up happening is then the students that nobody wants end up coming back to the public school. That's been true when kids went off to private school or to Catholic school, and it's the same with charter schools. But ultimately, for example, in Schenectady, this school is closing, and they will be coming back, And of course, they'll be welcome back. Individual students, nobody's going to hold it against them. But that means a set of parents are coming back that we need to work with to convince that we really do want them there and we really do value their students. And we are the educator of last resort. If vouchers were allowed, you would quickly see that it would be the lowest functioning students would, for the most part, end up in the public schools. And then, that's just the way any of those systems work. So, and if you look at who has been hurt most in this region by charter schools, is the Catholic schools. In Schenectady, several of the Catholic schools closed because many of their students thought, oh, here's a free private education. And it's had, I think, some of the same effect in Albany. I'm not as familiar how many Catholic schools have been impacted, but Albany certainly has been impacted more by charter schools than Schenectady.
You speak of charter schools as being kind of a profit-driven.
In fairness, some people that started charters are very committed to taking a group of students and trying to do a better job. But I don't think that's any different than within the public schools. If the state says, well, this charter school doesn't have to meet all the requirements that a public school meets, they could have also allowed, and they did in the past, public schools could apply for waivers on certain state rules in order to try some more experimental approach. So there's no reason that that can't also happen within public schools. And I think we should always be trying new experiments to how can we do this better. There's no question that that's a good thing. I don't think funneling taxpayer money to private entities is the way to do it.
Can you just elaborate a little bit more on the waivers of
In the
allowing
past?
teachers to teach it less stricted towards the state regulations and have
Well, in the past, they allowed, which is no longer the case, there used to be, the students could do portfolios, for example, maybe in place of one of the Regents tests. In charter schools, a lot of the things they're allowed to do, they don't have to have all certified teachers. They can have a certain percent that aren't, whereas public schools are mandated to hire certified teachers, even in cases where they might have someone that could do a better job that isn't. In charter school, some of those restrictions that they put on the public schools, they don't put on them. And there's no reason not to allow some of the same experimentation. Open schools was an example where, there were certain differences that were allowed. And public schools have always run sort of mini experiments within them to try and find better approaches.
The lady we spoke to earlier talked about how it has been tried to make a profit off of charter schools, but it just hasn't been effective. Is there proof in the other direction that Tom Edison?
Well, they've many times gone into a district, and then when they leave when things aren't going well, and that's one of the things they can do. The public school can't leave. We're there, so that might be one way they could make money if they get out in time. I would think the ways they can save money are on salaries. That would probably be the biggest way, and that's certainly another. There are a lot of different agendas people bring to this, and really, truly, there are very sincere and I think genuine efforts just to do things better. But another kind of tangential reason for charter schools is to bust teacher unions. Pretty straightforward, because they don't have to be unionized, and the public schools are all unionized. That means then they can lower salaries or change benefits. So that certainly is another. Some people support them for that. There's a lot of different agendas. And we're one of the biggest unions, aren't we? The biggest, I think, left. So hey, we're it.
For their interview with Cynthia, she explained how a charter school is funded. She said 70% of the money comes from the federal, and then 30% they find from different companies. So is it still a private? Do you still consider it a private education, even though it's getting the majority of its funding from the state?
Well, it's coming from the state. The money, there's no money that I wouldn't think their money is coming directly, and I don't know those percentages if they're the same in every charter school. So I can't speak to that. No, I think that's one of the issues. We're taking public money, and we're giving it to private companies to run schools. And personally, I don't think that's right. If we were funding all of our public schools very well, and then we did that, but we're not. And that's money that could instead be going into public schools, and with standards and with experimentation, we could also, within public schools, try and improve. We always do.
So it sounds as if that your belief is that the charter school should pick a side. It's either you're public or you're private.
Well, no, you're right, they're getting public funding, but they're privately run schools. So I guess, that's a pretty good world if you can pull it off to get that money. But I think the reality is it's hard to educate everyone, and they're finding that too, And so there is no panacea. The initial program, Sabbath, had a curriculum that they came in with, and all the students were going to do wonderfully with that. Well, if there was a program that would teach all students perfectly, we'd be using it. That's not. And so, of course, they ran into trouble. And now they changed management, and then they changed again. So I think, the bottom line is it's not easy to educate everybody. And when you have a huge mix in front of you, it's not easy. When I was in first teaching, you had a group of kids, and you were teaching the same thing. Now I have students, and just as an example, if I'm giving a test, I might have 28 kids there. 4 of them can have the test read to them. 2 of them can have the directions simplified. Another one, can have a separate location, and then there's all permutations of that. And I'm trying to just give a test, and I'm supposed to be keeping all of this straight. Kids are supposed to get their lessons modified so that they're doing the same work, but this one maybe needs it in larger print, or this one needs, and so you have, a lot you're trying to do and to modify and to reach all the different students that are sitting in front of you. So it's it's a big challenge. It's not that it can't be done, but there need to be a lot of supports and time to plan and time, availability to copy, which we constantly fight about.
So charter schools are public schools, but they operate as.
Well, they are funded by public monies, let's put it that way.
And they're private, they're public,
Like private
but,
public.
that's ridiculous. They're operated as a private school. And so can a charter school reject?
When the state put in the charter school law, there are some restrictions, and when they put in their charter, they will say what student population they're looking for, and there are methods of selection to try and prevent them from doing that. But you probably can drive people out if they're really driving you crazy, They can't necessarily, I don't know that they can kick students out. They probably can. They could expel. As a public school, in the extreme case, we can expel. It doesn't happen often, but so
Charter schools can expel.
they can expel students, and then guess who they come to? And that's okay that we have all students, but it seems like if you want to set them up as a fair, let's find better ways to educate, we should have kind of a level playing field with the same issues confronting both schools.
That's what I'm thinking, could a charter school deny some,
Entry, probably not. Some of them do it like the lottery, or they have, when they set up what they're doing, they actually say who their target population is, and the state could come in and look and say, well, you said you were going to do this, but you're doing that. So they each have a charter, and it would be crafted within their charter. If you are interested, I do have a ton of information on charter schools, like probably way more than you would ever be interested in looking at. But the league did a pretty intensive study of both the funding and then the evaluation of charter schools and how it compares to public schools in order to make recommendations to the state. And I also have some of the original charter school law,
Okay.
which is pretty thick.
As far as the way a charter school functions with they're allowed to, they're autonomous and allowed to develop their own curriculum, but I find that a lot of them are actually more strict in their curriculum and more
They might be, yeah.
set. But as far as at 9:30 we have to teach this subject. At 9:35 we need to move on to this, and
That I would think that would vary from school to school, and I couldn't make a blanket statement about whether most of them are doing that. I would imagine most of them are educators, so they kind of start at the same point as the rest of us. So how creative they're being, some probably are, and that would certainly be wonderful to hear success stories and what we can do to improve, but most of them really aren't doing anything all that innovative or different, would be my impression.
Oh, can you say that again? But compared to public schools, are they not being innovative amongst each other or amongst just school education in general?
Or not even innovative, but like discipline-wise, because the school has more, leeway on how they discipline the students. Whereas in public school, you have to kind of be you can't. You have to, because you'll have parents. Well, you'll have parents from charter school who actually come with voice and they don't like the rule. But with public schools, there's certain things you can't do because it'll make your school look bad.
Okay. I would say that with public schools, and again, it would depend, Some public schools would have more of that. Some programs within public schools would have more parents who are vocal. Some public schools would have parents that aren't very vocal, and actually that's a detriment because that can help get you things if you if you have a school that's pretty poor and the parents don't feel welcomed or don't feel that they can speak up or don't feel comfortable and respect themselves enough to feel they would be listened to, then you might not get as much because it's easy to ignore you. So it's sometimes a good thing to have vocal parents. I would think charter schools, in a large case, have vocal parents. I can't imagine, if you're choosing to take your child out of the public school and putting them in, you've already selected for parents that are somewhat more involved. So that, to me, would be an advantage a charter school would have, just that somebody bothered to fill out the paper and move their child. It's at least a parent who cares. But as you're pointing out, that can also get in the way because the parents might sometimes have ideas that you're saying their son did X and they're saying no. And, that happens within, I'm sure, in charter schools, and it happens in public schools where something happens and then it goes up the line and decisions are overturned.
So, would you say charter schools have more control over how they discipline than public schools? 'Cause
No, I don't know that that's true. No, probably not. We make our choices. The board sets up discipline policy, and then
Okay, let's talk about No Child Left Behind. The effects of that, or not the effects of that, but like what it is, what it has done to public education, and the benefits and the downfalls.
well, I think No Child Left Behind. How can you be against that? I mean, it is, of course, that should be the goal of education. No child left, or all students can learn. There's several. I think the biggest problem with it is it has translated into testing, and I don't. The monies to pay for the testing haven't come, so that means if you want to hire more teachers, but you also have to administer these tests, they cost a lot of money to administer, to correct, to do all of that. So that's one fault I would have, that the money didn't come to fund it. And states like Vermont talked about possibly rejecting it because they felt they were losing more than they were getting. And I think it was at Arizona, there was a state out west with a Republican governor that also was threatening, maybe it was Utah, to do the same thing, that the money wasn't there to pay for it, and so they could just opt out. I think to bring anything that brings attention to improving education is a good thing. So certainly to be talking about it is a good thing. To say that the way you do it is by testing and labeling schools, I don't know exactly what that accomplishes. If you get bad press, then more people move out of your district, and so you've got more problems. Or they talk about, well, if after 2 years the student's school doesn't improve, they can transfer to another school. Well, that's only if there's room in another school. Or in our district, there's one high school, so where are they transferring to? So again, some of the ideas sound good, but there's really no implementation because there's nowhere for the students to go. Those things I don't see. So I think a lot of it has been lip service, but it seems pretty clear that it hasn't really done what it wanted. In some cases, there were monies for class reduction, and that was a good thing, and districts took advantage of it if they could get the money. If you can take an elementary class and make it smaller and get the kids off to a really good start, that's going to, have an impact for the rest of their education. So that's a good thing, but those monies were not huge, and they don't stay forever. So.